The echo of gunfire cracked through the autumn air as Pearl Callahan sprinted toward the riverbank, her heart hammering against her rib cage with each desperate stride. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory had become both her salvation and her nightmare in the span of a single night. Pearl's lungs burned as she pushed through the underbrush, the shouts of her pursuers growing more distant with each step. Her honey-blonde hair had fallen loose from its pins, whipping wildly behind her as she ran. At 22, she had never imagined her life would come to this, fleeing through the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a small leather pouch containing her mother's wedding band and the last of her money. The hem of her dress was torn and muddy, catching on brambles as she scrambled down the increasingly steep embankment. The rushing sound of water grew louder, promising either escape or another obstacle. Pearl glanced over her shoulder, searching for signs of pursuit through the dense pines. The momentary distraction was her undoing. Her foot slipped on the wet rocks, and suddenly the ground disappeared from beneath her. Pearl tumbled down the slope, a startled cry escaping her lips before she plunged into the frigid waters of the Yellowstone River. The shock of cold stole her breath as the current immediately seized her, dragging her downstream. Pearl fought against panic, struggling to keep her head above water as her sodden skirts pulled her down like an anchor. The river was swollen from recent rains, its surface churning with dangerous force. "Help!" she called, but her voice was lost in the rush of water. Her arms flailed as she struggled to swim, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. Just as her strength began to fail, her gaze locked on something unexpected: a man on horseback, galloping alongside the riverbank. Isaac Nash had spent the better part of the day tracking a small herd of wild horses that had been grazing near his property. At 30 years old, he had carved out a modest living for himself in the Montana wilderness, preferring the company of his horses and the open range to the bustling towns that were springing up throughout the territory. When the sound of a woman's cry reached his ears, Isaac immediately pulled his chestnut stallion to a halt. Scanning the rushing river, he spotted a flash of fabric and pale skin being swept downstream. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, racing along the riverbank until he was ahead of the struggling figure. "Hold on," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him. Isaac dismounted in a fluid motion and secured his horse to a nearby tree before stripping off his heavy leather duster. The woman was drawing closer, her struggles becoming weaker as the current pulled her under, then pushed her back to the surface. Isaac waded into the shallows, bracing himself against the river's pull. As Pearl's limp form swept toward him, he lunged forward, catching her arm and pulling her against his chest with a strength born of years working the land. The current threatened to drag them both under, but Isaac's footing remained sure as he hauled her toward the shore. Pearl was barely conscious, her lips tinged blue with cold, her slender frame trembling violently as Isaac carried her to dry land. She coughed weakly, expelling river water as he gently laid her on the grassy bank. "Miss, can you hear me?" Isaac's voice was deep but gentle, his calloused hands checking for injuries with surprising tenderness. Pearl's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. "There." "Coming," she managed between chattering teeth. Isaac didn't ask who they were. The fear in her eyes told him enough. Without another word, he retrieved his duster coat and wrapped it around her shivering body. The heavy leather enveloped her small frame entirely, still warm from his body heat. "I've got you now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're safe." Pearl wanted to believe him, but her mind was foggy with cold and terror. She felt herself being lifted again, this time onto the back of a horse. A strong arm circled her waist, holding her securely as the animal moved forward at a steady pace. "My name's Isaac Nash," the man said, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles from here. We'll get you warm and dry, and you can tell me who you're running from." Pearl tried to respond, but exhaustion overcame her. The last thing she remembered was the gentle sway of the horse beneath her and the solid warmth of the stranger at her back. When Pearl awakened, she found herself in an unfamiliar room. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. She was lying on a narrow bed, covered with several thick woolen blankets. The cowboy's duster coat was hanging on a hook near the door, and her own clothes were nowhere to be seen. Panic flared briefly until she realized she was wearing a man's cotton shirt that reached to her knees. The garment was clean but worn soft with age. As she struggled to sit up, the door to the room opened and Isaac stepped inside carrying a steaming mug. "You're awake," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I was beginning to worry." Pearl drew the blankets tighter around herself, suddenly conscious of her state of undress. "My clothes hanging to dry," Isaac explained quickly. "I hope you don't mind the shirt. I had to get you out of those wet things before you caught your death. I was as proper as circumstances allowed, miss." A flush colored Pearl's cheeks, but she nodded her understanding. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Nash." "Isaac," he corrected, handing her the mug. "It's just broth, but it'll help warm you from the inside. Think you can manage?" Pearl took the mug, grateful for its warmth against her palms. "My name is Pearl Callahan. Miss Callahan." Isaac nodded, taking a seat on a wooden chair near the bed. He was a striking figure, Pearl noticed for the first time. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong, clean-shaven jaw. His eyes were the deep blue of a mountain lake, intelligent and watchful. "Now, Miss Callahan, would you care to tell me why you were fleeing through the woods and ended up in the Yellowstone?" Pearl sipped the broth, considering how much to reveal. There was something about Isaac Nash that inspired trust, but years of caution were not easily set aside. "I was working in Billings," she began carefully. "At the Golden Star Hotel." Understanding flickered in Isaac's eyes, but no judgment. "Go on." "The owner, a man named Vernon Blackstone, he took liberties with the girls who worked for him. When I refused his advances, he claimed I had stolen from him." Pearl's hands trembled slightly, causing ripples in the broth. "He set his men on me, said they'd bring me back for punishment or worse." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Blackstone, I know of him, not a man who takes kindly to being defied." "No," Pearl agreed softly. "I ran with nothing but what I could carry. They chased me for miles before I reached the river, I thought." She paused, the memory of her fear still raw. "I thought I was going to die in that water." "Well, you didn't," Isaac said simply. "And you won't be going back to Billings either." Pearl looked up sharply. "You don't understand. Blackstone has connections, lawmen, politicians. He'll keep looking." "Let him look," Isaac replied, his voice hardening. "This is my land, Miss Callahan. I don't take kindly to trespassers, especially those hunting innocent women." Something in his tone made Pearl believe him, though she scarcely knew this man. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger, Mr. Nash?" Isaac stood, moving to stoke the fire. "Out here, Miss Callahan, we help those in need. It's how we survive." He turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. "Get some rest. Your clothes should be dry by morning, and we can figure out what to do then." As he reached the door, Pearl called after him. "Isaac, thank you for pulling me from the river, for your coat, for everything." He nodded once, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before he disappeared through the door, leaving Pearl alone with her thoughts and the crackling of the fire. The next morning brought clarity and unexpected comfort. Pearl awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the cabin's main room. Her clothes, now clean and dry, were folded at the foot of the bed. She dressed quickly, grateful to find that Isaac had even managed to mend the torn hem of her skirt. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found him at the stove, frying bacon in a cast iron pan. The cabin was modest but well-maintained, a single large room with a kitchen area, a solid wooden table with 2 chairs, a small sitting area near the fireplace, and the bedroom she'd occupied. Everything spoke of practicality and self-sufficiency. "Good morning," Isaac greeted without turning around. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Pearl helped herself to a cup, appreciating the rich aroma. "You have a lovely home," she offered. Isaac glanced at her, amusement in his eyes. "It's not much, but it's mine. Paid for it with 6 years of breaking horses and driving cattle. It's peaceful," Pearl said, taking a seat at the table. "I haven't known much peace lately." Isaac served up plates of bacon and biscuits, sitting across from her. "I've been thinking about your situation. Blackstone isn't likely to give up easily, especially if he thinks you've humiliated him." Pearl nodded grimly. "I know." "I have a proposition," Isaac said, meeting her gaze directly. "Stay here at least until the first snow." By then, Blackstone might have found another target for his attention. Pearl stared at him, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "Stay here with you, but that would be improper," Isaac finished for her, a wry smile touching his lips. "Miss Callahan, we're 50 miles from the nearest town. Out here, propriety takes second place to survival." "I couldn't impose," Pearl protested, though the thought of having a safe place to stay was tempting beyond words. "It's not an imposition if you earn your keep," Isaac replied pragmatically. "I could use help around here. The cabin needs attention. I don't have time to give it, what with the horses and winter preparations." Pearl considered his offer. The alternative was to keep running with no destination and no resources. "What would people say?" she asked, more to herself than to him. "There's not many people around to say anything," Isaac pointed out, "and those that know me well enough not to question my business." After a moment's hesitation, Pearl nodded. "All right, Mr. Nash, I accept your offer at least until the first snow." "Isaac," he reminded her, "if we're to be sharing a roof, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Isaac," Pearl agreed, offering him a tentative smile, "and you must call me Pearl." That smile, Isaac would later recall, was the moment something shifted between them, something neither could have anticipated when he pulled her from the river just the day before. The days that followed established a rhythm that suited them both. Pearl took charge of the cabin, cleaning and organizing with an efficiency that impressed even the methodical Isaac. She discovered a talent for cooking with limited supplies, creating meals that made Isaac realize how sparse his own efforts had been. For his part, Isaac taught Pearl about ranch life, how to gather eggs from the few chickens he kept, how to tend the vegetable garden that supplied much of their food, even how to handle the gentler horses in his small herd. "You have a way with them," he observed one afternoon as Pearl stroked the nose of a young mare. "They trust you." "Animals are often better judges of character than people," Pearl replied, thinking of how easily Blackstone had fooled her with his initial kindness. Isaac studied her face, noting the shadow that crossed her features. "He hurt you, didn't he, Blackstone? More than you've said." Pearl's hand stilled on the mare's velvet nose. "Not in the way you're thinking. He never. I got away before that, but he hurt others. Girls younger than me with no one to protect them." She turned to face Isaac, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have done something sooner." "You did what you could," Isaac said gently, "and you're alive because of it." "Sometimes survival doesn't feel like enough," Pearl whispered. Isaac stepped closer, his movement deliberate, giving her time to step away if she wished. When she didn't, he carefully tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "It's enough for now. The rest comes later when you're ready." The touch was brief, but it left Pearl's skin tingling long after he'd returned to his work with the horses. Something was growing between them, a connection born of shared solitude and mutual respect that neither had expected. As September gave way to October, the days grew shorter and cooler. Pearl found herself watching Isaac as he worked, admiring the quiet competence with which he approached every task. He was unlike any man she had known, straightforward in his speech, respectful of her boundaries, and possessed of an integrity that seemed as natural to him as breathing. Isaac, too, found his gaze drawn to Pearl with increasing frequency. He noticed the way sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. He admired her determination as she mastered new skills, her laugh when something delighted her, the thoughtful expression that crossed her face when she believed no one was watching. One evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Isaac finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "What were you before, Pearl?" Before the Golden Star, Pearl set aside the shirt she was mending one of his and considered the question. "I was a schoolteacher, if you can believe it, in Pennsylvania. I came west after my parents died, thinking adventure awaited." She gave a rueful smile. "Adventure found me, though not the kind I'd imagined." "A schoolteacher," Isaac repeated, smiling. "That explains your excellent penmanship. I saw your notes in the margins of my almanac." Pearl blushed. "I hope you don't mind. I was making calculations for the garden next spring." She paused, realizing she was thinking of staying beyond winter. Isaac noticed her hesitation. "I'd welcome your input on spring planting," he said carefully, "if you were still here." The air between them grew charged with unspoken possibilities. Pearl looked down at her hands, suddenly uncertain. "Isaac, I should tell you, after what happened with Blackstone, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't be dependent on any man again." "Is that what you think this is?" Isaac asked quietly. "Dependency." Pearl met his gaze. "I don't know what this is," she admitted. "But it frightens me how much I've come to value being here, with you." Isaac set aside the bridle he'd been repairing and moved to kneel before her chair. He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "Pearl, I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you have nowhere else to go. If you decide to leave come spring, I'll make sure you have the means to start fresh wherever you wish." "And if I choose to stay?" Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I would be the most fortunate man in the territory," Isaac replied simply. The honesty in his eyes undid her. Pearl leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, and for a moment they simply breathed together, on the cusp of something neither had been looking for. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of riders approaching. Isaac was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to potential danger. "Stay inside," he instructed, reaching for the rifle mounted above the door. "It's likely nothing, but best to be cautious." Pearl's heart raced as Isaac stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. Through the window, she could see 3 riders approaching in the fading light. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold with recognition. One of them was Luther, Blackstone's most trusted enforcer. She heard the exchange of words, though she couldn't make out what was being said. Isaac's posture remained relaxed, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. After a brief conversation, the riders turned their horses and moved away, but not before one of them, Luther, cast a long look toward the cabin. When Isaac returned inside, his expression was grim. "Blackstone's men," he confirmed. "Looking for a blonde woman who ran off with some valuables. Said they'd been searching ranches up and down the territory. Pearl sank into a chair, trembling. "They found me." "They suspect," Isaac corrected. "I told them I live alone, that I haven't seen any woman matching your description, but they'll be back. Luther didn't believe me." "What do we do?" Pearl asked, fighting against the panic threatening to overwhelm her. Isaac was already moving, gathering supplies. "We leave. Tonight. I have a line camp up in the high country, a small cabin I use during summer grazing. They won't think to look there, especially with winter coming on." "But your home, your horses, I'll have my neighbor Pete check on things," Isaac said, continuing to pack. "He owes me a favor. The horses can fend for themselves until we return. They've done it before." Pearl stood, determination replacing fear. "I'll pack food, provisions." Within an hour, they had loaded 2 horses with essential supplies. Pearl changed into a pair of Isaac's old trousers for riding, secured beneath her skirts. The night had grown cold, and Isaac insisted she wear his duster coat again, just as she had the day he pulled her from the river. "It suits you," he said with a small smile as he helped her mount. They rode through the night, following trails that only Isaac seemed able to see in the darkness. Pearl's thighs ached from the unaccustomed activity, but she made no complaint. Behind them lay danger. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of safety. Dawn found them climbing into the foothills, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. By mid-morning they reached a small clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood, nestled against the mountainside. "It's not much," Isaac said as he helped Pearl dismount, her legs nearly buckling after the long ride. "But it's defensible, and few know of its existence." The line cabin was indeed small, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot. Isaac immediately set about starting a fire while Pearl organized their supplies. "We'll share the cot," Isaac said matter-of-factly. "It's too cold up here to sleep on the floor, and I promise to be a gentleman." Pearl nodded, too exhausted to feel embarrassment. When the fire was blazing, they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, then settled onto the cot, both still fully clothed, with Isaac's coat spread over them as an extra blanket. Despite her exhaustion, Pearl found sleep elusive. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she whispered into the darkness. Isaac's arm tightened around her waist. "No, and even if they did, they'd have to get through me first." The quiet conviction in his voice soothed her fears. Pearl shifted slightly, turning to face him in the dim light from the dying fire. "Why are you doing all this, Isaac? You barely know me." Isaac was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "I know enough," he finally said. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you work hard and don't complain. I know you hum to yourself when you think no one's listening, and you always save the last biscuit for me even when I can tell you want it." Pearl smiled despite herself. "Those are small things." "Life is made up of small things, Pearl," Isaac replied, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "It's the small things that tell you who a person really is." In the intimacy of the moment, with danger temporarily at bay and the world reduced to just the two of them in the firelight, Pearl did what she had been wanting to do for weeks. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Isaac responded with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, his kiss a question rather than a demand. When they parted, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Pearl Callahan," he admitted quietly. "I didn't expect it, and I don't want to rush you, but you should know." Pearl's heart swelled with an emotion she had not dared to name until now. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Isaac Nash," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "Being terrified is part of it," Isaac said with a soft laugh. "At least, that's what my father told me. Said if loving someone doesn't scare you a little, you're not doing it right." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, their confessions hanging in the air between them like a promise. They remained at the line cabin for 2 weeks, venturing out only for hunting and to check for signs of pursuit. The isolation could have been oppressive, but instead, it gave them space to learn each other without distraction. Pearl discovered that Isaac had a surprising knowledge of poetry, gleaned from books he read during the long winter months. Isaac learned that Pearl had a talent for storytelling, entertaining him with tales both real and imagined as they worked together to make the cabin more comfortable. Their kisses became more frequent, their touches more assured, but Isaac never pressed for more than Pearl was ready to give. There was a sweetness to their courtship, conducted as it was in the wilderness, far from societal expectations or judgment. One evening, as the first snow of the season dusted the mountains, Pearl made a decision. She watched Isaac as he cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and practiced, and thought about the weeks they had spent together, first at his ranch and now here in the high country. "Isaac," she said, drawing his attention, "I think it's time we went back." He set aside the rifle, studying her face. "Are you sure? Blackstone will always be a threat unless we face him," Pearl finished. "I can't hide forever, and I won't have you living like a fugitive because of me." Isaac moved to sit beside her on the edge of the cot. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to fight back," Pearl said with newfound resolve. "Blackstone's power comes from fear and silence. But what if we broke that silence? What if we found others he's hurt and stood together?" Isaac considered her words. "It would be dangerous. He has influence." "So do you," Pearl pointed out. "You have respect in these parts. People trust you. Between us, we might find a way to see justice done." A slow smile spread across Isaac's face. "There's that schoolteacher coming out," he said, admiration clear in his voice. "You're right. Running solves nothing." Pearl took his hands in hers. "Before we go back, though, there's something I need to tell you." She took a deep breath. "If we're to face Blackstone together, I want to do it as your wife. That is, if you'll have me." Isaac's expression transformed with wonder. "Pearl Callahan, are you proposing to me?" A blush colored her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "I suppose I am. It's not very traditional, but then, neither are we." In answer, Isaac drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. "Yes," he said when they finally parted. "1,000 times yes." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Livingston, with the local pastor and his wife as witnesses. Pearl wore her freshly laundered blue dress, and Isaac had shaved carefully for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken with a conviction born of shared hardship and growing love. After the wedding, they sent telegrams to the neighboring towns, seeking information about other women who might have suffered at Blackstone's hands. The responses came gradually at first, then in a flood stories of abuse, theft, and exploitation that painted a damning picture of the man who had terrorized so many. With the evidence mounting, Isaac and Pearl approached the territorial marshal, a stern but fair-minded man named Holbrook. Initially skeptical, Holbrook was swayed by the volume of testimony and Isaac's sterling reputation in the community. In December of 1878, Vernon Blackstone was arrested on multiple charges. The trial that followed was a sensation throughout the territory, with Pearl's testimony serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She spoke with clarity and courage, her gaze never wavering even when Blackstone's eyes bored into her with hatred. When the verdict of guilty was announced, Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Blackstone was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his empire of fear dismantled by the very people he had sought to control. As spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, Pearl and Isaac returned to the ranch that had become their home. The cabin had weathered the winter well under neighbor Pete's watchful eye, and the horses greeted Isaac with whinnies of recognition. Pearl stood on the porch, watching as Isaac checked the corral fencing, her hand resting lightly on her abdomen where new life was beginning to grow. They had faced danger together and emerged stronger. They had turned a chance encounter at a riverbank into a bond that would last a lifetime. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Nash?" Isaac asked, coming to stand beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. Pearl leaned into his embrace, remembering the day they met, how cold the river had been, how warm his coat had felt wrapped around her shivering body. "I was thinking about rivers," she said, smiling up at him. "How sometimes they take you places you never expected to go." Isaac brushed a kiss against her temple. "I'm glad your river brought you to me." "So am I," Pearl replied, taking his hand and placing it over the secret they had yet to share with the world. "So am I." In the years that followed, their love story became something of a legend in the territory: the schoolteacher who fell into the river while fleeing and the cowboy who pulled her out and covered her with his coat. Their ranch prospered, their family grew, and though life brought its share of challenges, they faced each one together with the same courage that had brought them through their first trial. And sometimes, on cool autumn evenings when the leaves were turning gold, Isaac would wrap Pearl in his old leather duster, and they would walk together along the river that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her a love worth fighting for.